when you are a small business in a developing country, the ability for a competitor to drive you out of business is actually pretty low. It doesn't seem to be the case in developing countries that people are really choosing self-employment because it, fits with their lifestyle or fits with what they want. It's because they actually don't have a choice, which is why they're willing to take that equivalent of the burger flipping job at the same rate. I would not say that, these really small businesses tend to be hampered by government. And actually, I think most of the historical narrative or most of the narrative among economists has actually been that they are unfairly subsidized.
Hello, welcome to the IEA's YouTube channel. I'm Daniel Freeman. Today, we'll be discussing development economics, or how countries can escape from poverty, and whether small business is a help or a hindrance in this effort. To do so, I'm delighted to be joined by Karthik Tadepalli. Karthik is a PhD student in economics at UC Berkeley who has researched and written extensively on this topic. Karthik, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, happy to be here.
Great. So you recently wrote an article for the US magazine Asterix, which generated a bit of controversy, which was titled, "Want Growth, Kill Small Business." What do you have against small business?
Well, I didn't come up with the title, but in retrospect, I do think it's a great title. I'm actually happy to stand by it, but I don't mean that I hate small businesses. What I do mean is that it feels as though I'm a jealous older sibling, or, that as in the developing world, we are these favoritist parents who, give all the resources to the prodigal younger son who doesn't actually add very much to the household while neglecting the older son who does a lot more. I think that's my feeling about small businesses. It's not that they're bad in any way. I think that actually as a way for people to stay out of poverty, like as individuals, it might be possibly the best strategy. That really there's a reason people are starting small businesses, why 90% of small businesses in a few developing countries tend to have just one or two employees. Well, it's because it's just a way for those people to earn supplementary income. The mistake is not in the businesses themselves. It's really in how we label them. The fact that we call them businesses kind of implies that they have something really in common with, a firm that we might think about in the US, like, an Apple or General Electric. So that's what I mean by a problem with them, is that there's a little bit of a sleight of hand being done when we talk about small businesses that I think doesn't translate into them having the potential to help countries grow. And so every dollar that we spend on them, it can reasonably and very correctly be described as a way to help people in poverty, and that's good. But it should never be thought of as a way to help economic growth, because that I do not think it is.
Yeah. No, I found your essay really, really interesting, not least just because of how many facts and statistics about just how big this sector is in a lot of developing economies it has in it. So you've got facts like over three quarters actually of all workers in sub-Saharan Africa are classified as self-employed, which seems astonishingly high when you compare it to, say, the US, where it's something like 7% of the workforce is self-employed. Why are so many people classified in this category in a lot of developing countries?
So there's a few reasons for it. One is because a lot of people who work in agriculture who are not themselves landed farmers, the way they make their living is by working as hired laborers on other people's farms. And, or, also, even if you are a farmer, you are self-employed if you have your own farm. So actually, that's a large chunk of the 75% is actually accounted for by farmers. So I don't want to, frame that necessarily as being, it's actually 75% of the people. I think what we think of as self-employed is usually the archetype of someone like a street vendor, right? That's kind of archetypal. And I think that is probably a much smaller part of it, although I've never seen disaggregations of that. But the other reason why is that wage work is pretty hard to find. Like, wage work is not that common. When people can find it, they tend to jump into it, even when the wages are not that much higher than self-employment. And they tend to try and stay with it when they have it. So it's just not that easy to get wage jobs. And, a lot of the jobs that you get are going to be temporary, contract jobs, or, yeah, there's a lot of spot markets for labor. Here's a job that I have for the next 3 days. I'll hire you. But then after that, you're on your own.
Yeah.
This kind of means that you don't have as much guarantee of any job. And so at any given point, you totally could have throughout the year many jobs that you hold, many wage jobs that you hold, but they're not going to be long-term jobs. And because of that, at any point when you're asked on a survey, are you self-employed? Probably the answer is yes. Probably that's what you are doing at the time because you haven't found a wage job.
Yeah. And so a lot of this self-employment, at least in cities, is actually in some sense kind of disguised unemployment or underemployment. And actually that was another interesting thing that came up, that you cite this study that finds in a lot of developing countries, people who transition from self-employment into wage labor basically do so for the same wage premium as someone going from unemployment to wage labor, which would indicate that most people don't view these conditions as actually being very different. So I found that quite interesting. You also but it's not just self-employment. You also focus on how there are some firms that do employ small numbers of people, but they don't seem to grow very much. What do you think are some of the reasons behind this?
Yeah, so let me first kind of underscore the sort of surprising nature of what you just said. The study that shows that people don't actually have a wage premium when they go from self-employment to wage employment. To understand why this is weird, imagine if someone was unemployed and they were offered a job flipping burgers, and they might not love the job, but it's money. They want money. Like, they might take the job. But now imagine that someone who was a freelance journalist or a self-employed accountant, that actually they were willing to take this burger flipping job. That would be pretty surprising to us, right? To us, self-employed jobs are not always the best jobs. It's not like, making it rich. But often people have good reasons to want them. Maybe they like working for themselves. Maybe they like, having control over their own hours. Or maybe they have, flexible, they need flexible work because of family commitments. But there's a good reason why they take the job that they do. And it doesn't seem to be the case in developing countries that people are really choosing self-employment because it, fits with their lifestyle or fits with what they want. It's because they actually don't have a choice, which is why they're willing to take that equivalent of the burger flipping job at the same rate as other people. So, the second part of your question, so that's just to highlight that it really is kind of surprising and not what we expect, just to put some concreteness on that. Second part of your question is, why don't these firms grow? I think the first basic answer is because they're not meant to grow. I think the people who are running these businesses, often a small number of employees means, you and the 3 people who help out at your shop, right? What does it mean to grow? Well, maybe it would mean setting up a new shop, but that's kind of a big investment. Maybe you don't have the ability to do that because you don't have the capital to set up a new shop, but also maybe you don't want to. Maybe the time commitment of running the shop is already enough for you. Really remember, this business is meant to give you a job. It's meant to give you a revenue source rather than providing sort of, maximum output or maximum profit. And so if you had 2 stores, yeah, you might make more money, but you'd have way more hours to commit. And maybe you wouldn't be able to find people to staff that new store. And maybe, if you did, they'd rob you. Or there's any number of reasons why someone who was running a small business might decide that it doesn't really it's not really that valuable for them to expand. But the second part of it is that it is really hard to grow as a business. I mean, think about it this way. You're not the only shop owner in the city, right? There's tons and tons of people who are also running the same business as you, just in a slightly different place. And, if we stick with the shop's image of what a business looks like, if you set up a new shop somewhere, I mean, who's to say anyone's going to go to it? People might just have a habit that they go to the same place that they used to go, or they might only go to the closest place. And so if there's anything closer to a customer than you, they might not go there. There's any number of reasons why, business growth is hard. I mean, in the sense that it always is hard. That might mean that small businesses in particular, where, small really does mean like one or two people, they're not as equipped to handle those challenges as you might be if you had a company of, say, 30 to 40 people, which in the Western world is what we call a small business. We don't think of a small business as two people. We think of it as, 30 people. And that's just a different level of capacity to grow.
Okay, so there are clearly difficulties with small business expanding, and the two things you focus on are kind of what you might call sort of market reasons for the lack of expansion, and also potentially a lack of social trust, say beyond people you immediately know. You mentioned this example of if you set up a second shop, what if the people running it end up robbing you? Are there any sort of particular government restrictions that are quite common across the developing world that make it difficult for businesses to expand?
I don't think that there's much that makes it difficult for these businesses to expand. So people often talk about, for example, labor regulations being onerous. Maybe, above a certain number of employees, you have some regulations you need to follow in order to hire or fire people. But actually, these are never binding. Like, these might be if you have 100 employees, right? Yeah. That's, for example, the case in India. But it is not binding if you have 3 employees. So in that sense, I would not say that, these really small businesses tend to be hampered by government. And actually, I think most of the historical narrative, or most of the narrative among economists, has actually been that they are unfairly subsidized. I mean, both because often, they are the target of schemes, but also implicitly, if the larger businesses are being taxed or, restricted or regulated, then the companies that they are competing with, i.e. the smaller, 3-4 person businesses, those have a relative advantage compared to how they otherwise would have. So that's what people normally say. I don't think people would, I think you wouldn't take that way too far. Obviously, the capacity differences are still large, but I don't think people would say that small businesses tend to be hampered by regulation.
No, I suppose what I mean is not so much that regulation is hampering the small business, but once you get to a certain threshold, if there is a load of new regulation that comes in once you hit, say, 10 employees, which I think, just going off some stuff that the MacArthur Center has produced on India, is there are some regulations that come in to do with odd things like the provision of spittoons that come in after you hit 10 employees, and that might act as a sort of disincentive to expand and an incentive to remain small.
So it's possible. So it's definitely possible that there are costs of this form. I think the real smoking gun you would look for, if this was true, was you would look at the sort of distribution of firm sizes, and you'd want to see that at this barrier of 10 or 50 or wherever the regulation kicks in, you see a big bunch of firms just kind of sitting just below that. All have 9 employees. Yeah. Many more of them have 9 than have 8, and many more of them have 9 than have 10.
Yeah.
This is not what people tend to find in the data. They do tend to find sort of more mass at below, but it's kind of more consistent with a view in which there's regulation, but it's more continuous than it seems. It's not as if it's just a switch flips after 10 and then you're all subject to these regulations. It's kind of more consistent with the bigger you are, just proportionally there's more regulation. And so it doesn't kind of, I don't think that we should think of it as taking the form of these explicit rules that kind of really, prevent firms from wanting to get big. But we should think of it more as the bigger you get, the more the government will come in and try to take a knock on you. But, it's not necessarily going to be in the form of explicit regulations.
Okay. And actually, I think you mentioned this in your essay that a lot of it, or one role seems to be played by the difficulty of moving across cities in the developing world. You mentioned that in in Mexico, for example, the number of small businesses seems to increase when petrol prices go up, because people are less likely to travel further, to travel outside of their neighborhoods when that happens. So they shop more in their neighborhoods, which means you get a proliferation of smaller street vendors and that side of things. Um, so okay, so we've talked about, to some extent, why this occurs. Why is it a bad thing? What's the problem with this?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to what you pointed out earlier, which is that they don't tend to grow very much. The businesses that we're talking about, they keep getting created because there are more and more people, just larger populations, but also more and more people who have the opportunity to set up businesses. Maybe it's easier than it used to be. So more and more people are doing it. The challenge, of course, is that this doesn't create sort of good jobs the way we would think of it, in the West today. There's a lot of discussion of good jobs and what do they mean? Well, usually what they mean is a stable source of income, a path to sort of prosperity for you and your family. And these businesses don't really provide that. They are kind of a lot more contingent, a lot more subject to random shocks of, what the economy is like. And so that's one challenge. The second challenge, of course, is that you need to be able to create more jobs for other people as well, right? Because not everyone is going to be able to set up a small business. I mean, there's lots of things in the economy that just can't be produced by a 3-person business. I mean, what, you can have a 3-person steel mill. It is not going to happen. And so if you have an economy that's full of small businesses, there are a lot of very important things that you just can't produce, that, there's less opportunities for people to find jobs in those good sectors, and, getting jobs that are kind of more high paying in a way. I think that wage work just does tend to be paid better than self-employment. And it's because you're doing something that is more productive. Even if there's going to be some division of the wage between the worker and the employee, the total pie that you're dividing is just larger than if you're a self-employed worker. Because if you're self-employed, the real value of what you're creating is just kind of small. There's a lot of people who are doing what you're doing. There's a very small number of businesses that you can actually feasibly operate in as a small operator. You're not going to be making that much money. And if the businesses are not making that much money, that also kind of aggregates to the economy as a whole. You end up with an economy that specializes in these really low profit, small scale services that these businesses can actually work in, and doesn't have a lot of jobs for people outside of that.
Yeah. And you don't get these economies of scale that you would hope to get in big manufacturing, in larger businesses.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you focus quite a lot on manufacturing as kind of the driver of economic development, and certainly that happened in China and a lot of the East Asian economies. Would you apply this general principle of bigger is often better to agriculture as well, or do you think this is a kind of separate category where small scale farming can work quite well?
So yeah, you can think of the part of the reason why I focus on manufacturing is actually just because that's what a lot of the studies focus on, and so it's easier to make statements that are clear about manufacturing because you are actually relying on real research. I do think that a similar version of this argument holds in agriculture. I wouldn't necessarily be as certain about it. I think this is a little bit more of a conjecture. There's a little bit more evidence still, but it's not as definitive. I think that the question you're asking can be reframed as, are there economies of scale in agriculture? Are there ways in which, if you have a larger farm, you can produce more cheaply than someone else would with a smaller farm? And I think the answer to that is yes. So it's definitely, there's a sort of well-established historical fact that this kind of inverse farm size productivity relationship, which is larger farms tend to have lower yields. So it's kind of a surprising thing, and people are usually kind of trying to find ways to explain why larger farms would have low yields. How Asia Works, a famous book by Joe Studwell, is actually really based on the idea of small scale farming being a lot more efficient just in terms of land terms, because people allocate a lot more time to sort of maximizing the yield out of the land. I think that this is a little bit misleading, both because I think the evidence on this is kind of a little bit mixed as to whether it actually is sort of more productive when you have smaller farms, but also because the thing that we actually care about is not necessarily how much yield you get per farm, but how much yield you get per worker. So if you have, because that's kind of what we want. We want to be able to feed people, right? So if you can produce more output with less workers and more land, that's good, because that means that you can feed more people can leave agriculture and go into other sectors that are more productive. And so when you think about it as how do we produce more output per worker, large farms do tend to have an unambiguous yield advantage. I think this is not contested by any of the studies that I've read. The output per worker of large farms is always higher than the output per worker of small farms. And I think there's an intuitive reason for that, which is that on large farms, you can put in a lot more capital. You can start using tractors instead of having workers, pull and till every inch of the land. You're more likely to have irrigation, so you get more out of the land than you otherwise would. You're much more likely to have the capital to invest in sort of high quality seeds, for example. So it does matter to have scale, because there's a lot of investments that you can make in increasing agricultural productivity that are very difficult for small scale farmers to make. A small scale farmer can buy some fertilizer, but they may not. A lot of them wouldn't. And they definitely can't, they usually can't mechanize their agriculture because, again, they don't have the scale to do so. So I definitely think that our economies of scale in agriculture, there's definitely some evidence that that is true and important, but it's less than you might think. And we're still learning more about that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I don't know if you came, there's recently been a study released by, I think, Oliver Kim, and have you come across this one where it's about Joe Studwell has this great idea about how East Asian agriculture became much more efficient because they redistributed the land to lots of small scale peasants, and that was much more efficient. And then Oliver Kim and co have actually looked at the data from Taiwan and found where you do get more land reform, where you do get smaller farms, they actually get lower yields relative to the places where you get less.
Yes. So I know Oliver is a friend of mine. He finished his PhD at Berkeley, and he and Jen Quan Wang, like their study does kind of show. I think it's more of a no, like that it's not better to have land reform, and when they do find effects, they're pretty small. So I think that it was kind of helpful that's part of what I meant when I referred to mixed evidence. There's also, for example, part of this farm size productivity relationship is based on self-reported yield measures. And I think there's also some evidence that small farmers systematically overestimate their yields. And when we kind of take effective measurements of yields based on like cutting the crops to see how much that is, that relationship is significantly weakened and possibly disappears. So I think that, that's part of what I mean when I say that it's not established fact that small farms have yield advantages, but even if it was, I think the more important thing really is output per worker, and their large farms are unambiguously better.
Yeah.
And I do want to make a point that I think that people tend to object to this mainly on the grounds that small farming is kind of seen as a way for livelihood, right? So even if it's not necessarily the best for maximizing GDP or maximizing agricultural output, the fact that people can make a living as farmers, that is surely probably better than being agricultural laborers, is I think valued, and I think correctly valued. I think it is good. I do think that it puts the imperative on us to create opportunities for people outside of agriculture that are better. I think that often these do exist, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes, maybe the best thing if you aren't a farmer is you go into a city that has no manufacturing, that really has a kind of very resource-based economy. This happens sometimes in sub-Saharan Africa, where the opportunities for jobs are significantly lower and possibly not even better than agriculture. So I don't think we should necessarily always see this as like a reason why small farms are terrible. It's just that it does say that our priority is on making sure that people leave agriculture and go into highly productive jobs outside of agriculture.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose there's this idea of sort of consumer and producer cities that kind of Weber talks about, that sometime in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, you have urbanization as people leave farms, but there isn't really an industrial base to go with that. So people sort of move into cities and then end up, as you say, working in like very low productivity services or manufacturing. Yeah. Okay. So I sort of moving on from this slightly, I wonder, in your view, how kind of important are institutions and policies relative to sort of cultural attitudes to small business and business growth? Because one of the things you bring up actually is how kind of cannibalistic American business kind of is. You get a lot, like, Americans set up loads of small businesses. It's just most of them fail really quite quickly, but the ones that don't fail end up massively growing. And so, if you get an American business, if you 15 years after it's established, will usually have 4 times as many employees as it does 5 years after it's established. Whereas in India, it's only 10% bigger. How much of this phenomenon do you think is downstream of institutions and policy, and is there any sort of cultural element? Because we see from one of the studies you cite that American small businesses, like, Americans set up loads of small businesses, but they tend to be quite cannibalistic in the sense that most of them fail, and the ones that do succeed tend to absorb the workers from the ones that don't succeed. But there doesn't seem to be, perhaps in the US, there isn't as much of a sort of social stigma about failing as a small businessman. Is that something you'd buy into at all, or is it all down to sort of policy and institutions and broader economic factors?
I think that rather than either of these two things, the thing that I would highlight the most really is who starts a small business. Because if people starting small businesses are people who are trying to grow a business, you're going to get very different outcomes of if people who start a business are just people who want to survive and make a living. I think that is sort of the first place where I would look for an explanation, where if, I think if someone in the US set up a small business and then they didn't grow it all for 10 years, they might say, okay, let me do something else, right? I'll just find something else. Outside options are always there. There's many things that you can do. And so I think that's part of the explanation is sort of neither, that there's sort of these cultural attitudes towards entrepreneurs, nor about institutions and policies, but just who is doing it. I think that self-selection is an extremely important part of explaining why we see the trends that we do. But the second part I would say is probably, it's got to do a little bit more with the competitive environment. I think that it is just partly true that developing country, the ability for a competitor to drive you out of business is actually pretty low, because the markets are pretty fragmented, right? So they're fragmented both physically, of course, like you pointed out, people often can't travel that far. but also just in terms of information. It's not always easy to know, what are all the shops around me? How good are they? If you look at Google Maps, it might tell you here's 50 tailors in your area, and maybe none of them have that many reviews. Maybe it's hard to know which one is best. Maybe you already know one of them, and so you go to that person, but you don't know if any of the others are any good. So I think that's part of the challenge, is that competition doesn't really tend to force people out. And similarly, there's also an important role to play for intercity integration, right? So if it was easy for the best businesses in one city to start either setting up shop or just trading or exporting their goods into another city, then that would also have an important role for competition. Then your set of competitors is not just the firms in your neighborhood or the firms in your city, it's the firms everywhere in the country. That would also be a massive boost to competition. And some evidence shows that, when more infrastructure is constructed, it does actually tend to increase competition in this way. But it's not enough, on its own. And that's part of the explanation for why competition tends to be low. It's a weird form of non-competitiveness because it doesn't come about from, I think when we think of lack of competition, we think, oh, there's, one dominant business or a few dominant businesses. And that's definitely not the real situation. It's not that, there's a whole, thousands, millions of these businesses. It's just that they all occupy slightly different markets that they're all kind of off in their little own corner of the market, and they don't tend to either venture into other corners of the market or have their competitors ventured into their corner of the market. So you have this weird situation where even though there's millions of firms, they don't, possibly in the same, city as well, they don't tend to compete with each other very much.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because I think often you think of, competition is purely a factor of numbers. Like if you have 5,000 bakers in a city, you sort of assume that there must be loads of competition between them, but that may not necessarily be the case. So, sort of as a final question, a final point, are there any policy implications that that either countries in the developing world or NGOs or economists can kind of take from this this research that you've highlighted?
I think that the first takeaway would be that I think in the development policy world, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to help small businesses. And I think that time should be reallocated. I think that time and that money should be spent elsewhere. For example, I think microfinance as a trend in development policy is, I think the evidence is clear that it was modestly effective. Like it wasn't transformative, but it was okay. My conjecture, and I don't think this has been investigated, is that it might have actually been harmful by slowing down the reallocation of people into higher productivity jobs. If you're essentially subsidizing being a business owner, an owner of a really small business, does it mean that people are less likely to take up wage jobs and sort of slow down that reallocation? I think it's possible. And so I would really put a premium on us in the development policy world not advocating for more programs that benefit small businesses or that keep people in small businesses. And I'm also really addressing my comments to the development policy world because I do think that tends to be the audience that I reach. I don't think I doubt that a minister in Kenya is watching this with.
Oh, you never know.
Yeah, you could be optimistic. But yeah, the second thing I think is true is that it does mean that often growth will take the form of making big businesses bigger. And I think there's a lot of like getting used to this and not sort of feeling like this is a bad thing. I think that, for example, even in South Korea's growth history, the really large conglomerates were actually quite essential to the productivity growth of Korea and its subsequent rise. I think that, just getting used to the idea that when a country is successful at growing, we will probably be seeing it in the form of a few very large businesses that get even larger is something that we should get used to. I don't think it necessarily means we should subsidize all the big businesses. I don't think, that there's no reason to believe that would be more productive.
Yeah.
But it does mean that we should be looking for that as an outcome as opposed to looking for more small businesses or each small business growing by 10% or 20%.
Yeah.
And I think, the final thing is that there's a lot of policy measures that they kind of implicitly select for big companies because only big companies really take advantage of them. For example, if you have export promotion agencies that are meant to help your country export, well, obviously, first of all, most small businesses don't even make things that are tradable, so they're not going to be participating. But secondly, of course, even if they could, if they were making things, they probably wouldn't be making them at a scale that was suitable for exports, right? Suppose they were making textiles, they're making, children's toys. They're not going to be making enough to send abroad. And so if you have things like export promotion programs, that is a way in which you can select and push businesses to get bigger while filtering out the ones that don't have the potential to get bigger. So I don't think this is, I don't necessarily think that export promotion programs always work or that that's the end of the story, but it does kind of give you a new way to look for policies that will be better.
Yeah. So it's essentially you're not saying you're basically saying we ought to have a sort of size neutral approach when it comes to businesses, as in not specifically subsidize small ones, and acknowledge that generally what happens as countries industrialize and develop is that you do get consolidation to a certain extent and more large business, and that's okay because productivity is good and basically all human progress comes in some way from that. If that's
and to make it really concrete, if a few large firms are growing, but what does growing mean? Well, it means growing in employment, right? They're employing a lot more people than they used to before, and I think also implicitly more people than would otherwise have had jobs in the economy as a whole, right? That's part of what productivity growth means, is that you actually are creating new jobs for people and not just simply reallocating people between self-employment and wage jobs, which I think people could justifiably say that's fine, but it's not necessarily a worthy goal for governments.
Yeah. And presumably allows for a greater degree of specialization and, gains in skills and all that good stuff over time. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I think that's about all we've got time for. If you're watching at home and enjoyed this, please do like and subscribe and do all that side of things. But that's everything. Thank you for watching.